This hearing's called to order. Good afternoon. Welcome, Administrator Bridenstine. Next week, on October 1st, NASA will reach a new milestone. The National Aeronautics and Space Administration will turn 60. And I have to say, Mr. Administrator, you don't look a day over 55. The 60th anniversary of NASA's founding by Congress in 1958 provides an opportunity to not just look back at the past accomplishments, but to examine how we can build upon past glory, to push NASA and our national space program forward, to meet new challenges facing our nation in the 21st century. Our country should be proud of our history in space and recognize everyone who has stepped forward to serve our nation. The United States won the space race and planted an American flag on the surface of the moon that remains standing today. Many of the names that have made NASA a success, like Armstrong and Aldrin and Glenn, have become household names that are recognizable throughout the world. Others, like Katherine Johnson, Dorothy Vaughan, Mary Jackson, and all the women who served as human computers, have been hidden figures in our history and are just now getting the recognition that they deserve for their legacy of brilliance and strength. Looking forward, we have an opportunity to define a new generation, a generation that could witness American boots stepping foot on the surface of Mars and once again planting an American flag. However, in order to achieve this goal, there are a lot of key decisions that both Congress and the administration will have to make. I believe that this begins with extending the operation and utilization of the International Space Station beyond 2024 to 2030. American taxpayers have invested over $100 billion in the ISS, and it is important that we maximize the return on taxpayer investment. China is expected to have an operational space station in low Earth orbit by 2022. We cannot cede low Earth orbit to China or to any other nation. The United States government must consider having a permanent human presence in low Earth orbit, which may require a government station after the ISS reaches the end of its useful operation. This can be accomplished without directly competing with the private sector and private space stations. We must also look to extend the presence of American astronauts beyond low Earth orbit into cislunar and deep space. The Trump administration is establishing a plan to return astronauts to the lunar surface by 2029. I share the administration's goal of returning the United States to the moon to establish a human presence and to begin commerce. However, it is imperative that our national space program doesn't get bogged down on the moon at the expense of reaching Mars. As I have previously noted, Mars is, and I believe should be, the focal point of our national space program. Sending Americans to the surface of Mars and beyond will define this next generation. I would like to thank Administrator Bridenstine for being here today. We live in interesting times, and we have the opportunity to ensure together that as the next space race begins, the United States will once again remain the leader in space. Now recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Senator Nelson, to give his opening statement. Well, I now have the opportunity to introduce our witness, Mr. Jim Bridenstine, as the current administrator of NASA. In his role at NASA, Administrator Bridenstine provides clarity to the agency's goals and aligns the strategic and policy direction of NASA with the interests and requirements of the agency stakeholders and constituent groups. Prior to joining NASA, he was elected and represented Oklahoma's 1st Congressional District in the United States House of Representatives. Senator Inhofe's old seat, where he served on the House Armed Services Committee and the House Science, Space, and Technology Committee. Before joining Congress, Administrator Bridenstine served as the executive director of the Tulsa Air and Space Museum and Planetarium. Administrator Bridenstine also served honorably in the United States Navy as a naval fighter pilot where he flew combat missions in Iraq and Afghanistan. Administrator Bridenstine completed a triple major in Texas at Rice University and earned his MBA at Cornell University. The administrator is a dear friend of mine, and I will say, since he's been confirmed, every time I have the chance to interact with employees at NASA, with scientists, with engineers, just my flight from Houston to D.C., on Monday I sat next to two NASA engineers, and I asked everyone the same question, which is, how's Jim doing? What kind of job he's doing? And without exception, every person I've asked has given glowing reports. He's terrific, he's passionate, he cares about the agency, and we're moving in the right direction. So with that, Administrator Bridenstine, you may give your opening statement. Thank you, Administrator, and thank you for your good work. In your opinion, what are the top priorities for NASA that Congress should look to address in a new NASA reauthorization?
That's a wonderful question, Senator, and I think the biggest thing on my plate as the NASA administrator as we go forward is leading a sustainable return to the moon. And I don't even like to use the word return, to go forward to the moon, sustainably. So we have seen what happens with reusable rockets. The cost goes down and the access to space goes up. We want the entire architecture between the Earth and the moon to be reusable. We want tugs that go from Earth orbit to lunar orbit to be reusable. We want that gateway in orbit around the moon to be there for a very long period of time. Think of a reusable command module. So it will be there reducing cost because it is, in essence, not permanent, but it will be there for 15 years. And we want reusable landers that can go back and forth from the gateway to the surface of the moon. The more the architecture is reusable, the longer we're going to be able to take advantage of the resources of the moon and explore more parts of the moon than ever before. The other thing, and this is Space Policy Directive 1, commercial partners, international partners, sustainable architecture to the moon, take all of those capabilities, and this is a key part, and I heard this, of course, from Senator Nelson, take all of those capabilities and replicate them at Mars. The moon is our proving ground for the ultimate goal, which, sir, you have identified as well, which is we're going to Mars. The moon is our path, the best way to get there, to retire risk so we can have mission assurance getting to Mars. So focusing on those areas, the integration of international partners and commercial partners into a sustainable architecture, I think, is important. We also, and I know, Senator Cruz, you've been very laser-focused on the regulatory environment surrounding space. That's going to be tremendously helpful because this architecture is going to take advantage of all of our commercial partners. NASA will be able to buy services because there's a robust commercial marketplace where we are one customer of many customers rather than the purchaser, owner, and operator of certain systems. That drives down costs, increases access. So reforming the regulatory regime, I think, is important as well. And of course, another area that this committee I know has been focused on is the space situational awareness and space traffic management challenges that our country has. Certainly, we have astronauts. We're the only agency in the federal government that has humans in space threatened by the orbital debris that exists. So I think it's critical that we focus on that as well. The closest alligator to the canoe right now, sir, is launching American astronauts on American rockets from American soil for the first time since the retirement of the space shuttle. That's the one thing I'm focused on more than anything else because we need to make that happen by the middle of next year. We're on track to do that, and we're focused on it. So those would be my biggest takeaways.
Well, and I had the opportunity to join you at Johnson Space Center for the announcement of the first commercial crew of astronauts that will be launched on a U.S. rocket from U.S. soil, and that is a major milestone to return to for NASA.
Yes, sir.
You talked about, with respect to the moon, sustainability. Is it NASA's intention to construct a habitat that would be sustainable on an ongoing basis on the lunar surface? Is that part of the plan?
The answer is yes. Immediately, no. The first thing is we have to put what we call the gateway into what we call a near rectilinear halo orbit around the moon. So that's an orbit where it's balanced between the gravity well of Earth and the gravity well of the moon. And because it's balanced, it can stay there for a long period of time. But interestingly, it's also going to have propulsion, solar electric propulsion, which means it can not only stay in that halo orbit that's going to be equatorial in nature, but it can also go to the L1 point and the L2 point, giving landers more access to more parts of the moon than we've ever seen before. This is an important point. 1969, we landed on the surface of the moon. Up until 2008, we didn't know if there was water on the surface of the moon or not. People argued that maybe there was, but we had no definitive proof. In 2008, we learned that there was. 2009, we now know that there's hundreds of billions of tons of water ice on the surface of the moon. So this architecture, in my opinion, sir, the best place to start is getting more landers and more rovers and more prospectors to more parts of the moon than ever before so that we can discover and learn things that we didn't learn from 1969 to 1972 when we were landing in the equatorial regions. If we go direct to the habitat on the surface of the moon, we run the risk of learning a whole lot about one spot on the moon. And given the constraint of the budget, it's my assessment that we need to have more access to more parts of the moon. And humans would certainly be part of that, but not necessarily a permanent human presence. Of course, in the long term, yes. And the architecture is open, which means commercial partners, they can build their own habitats. And in fact, a lot of them right now are raising private capital to do just that, which we love, because then we could, in essence, be a customer of that habitat for NASA's exploration and research as well.
And describe to this committee and the American people the importance of water on the moon for sustainability and human habitation.
Yes, sir. Wonderful question. So water represents, of course, drink. You know, we get to drink this. It keeps us alive. But it's also hydrogen and oxygen. Oxygen is air to breathe. And if you think about what powered the space shuttles, for example, rocket engines, it was liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen that powered the space shuttle. In fact, you know, our vehicles today that we're building, the Space Launch System, is powered with liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen. So water is life support, but it's also rocket fuel. And if we can figure out a way, even commercially, where NASA would be a customer, we'd have, you know, commercially, people could harness the water ice of the surface of the moon, put it into orbit in cryogenic form, in you know, highly pressurized, frozen form, solid form, or I should say liquid form. That liquid hydrogen, liquid oxygen could be, in essence, a fueling depot in orbit around the moon. The glory of the moon, unlike the Earth, the moon has no atmosphere. So if you look at the things that we launched off the moon back in the 1960s, 1970s, those items, you would never see anything like that launch off the surface of the Earth. Why? Because there's no atmosphere on the moon. And the gravity well is 1/6 that of the Earth. It's easy to get things off the surface of the moon. It's very difficult to get things off the surface of the Earth. So when there is an asset, a natural resource, like water, that is on the surface of the moon, and we know it's there in hundreds of billions of tons, in my estimation, we should utilize it. Now, again, I'm not saying that, you know, this is kind of science fiction in the future, kind of thinking about the future. But if we could, then we could, in essence, reposition satellites in geostationary orbit around the Earth using fuel from the moon, which would be potentially, in the future, less expensive than using fuel from the Earth. And I'm not saying that it is. This is something to think about in the future. But there are natural resources on the surface of the moon. The other thing that's important to note, Space Policy Directive 1 says, for the first time in American history, we're going to utilize the resources of the moon. We're going to utilize that water ice. We now know, because of the research NASA does, that there's water ice on the moon. And in fact, there's new water being created every day from charged particles coming from the sun impacting the regolith on the moon. Now, we're not creating tons of ice or water on the moon. That's not happening. But there is a hydrocycle, there's a water cycle on the moon that a number of years ago we didn't even know existed. What else do we not know about the moon? And that's why I think it's so important to go to more parts of the moon than ever before. We know there are rare earth metals on Earth. Those rare earth metals are not earth metals at all. They're asteroid impacts from a very long time ago. And we know that the moon probably went through the same debris fields that the Earth went through back in those days, which means, could there be those kind of metals on the moon where there isn't an active geology, where there isn't an active hydrosphere? Could those rare earth metals be there? I don't know. NASA doesn't know. In fact, nobody knows. But if there's potentially trillions of dollars of that activity there, it would make sense that could change the balance of power on Earth And of course, that's why a lot of private companies are raising money to go to the moon, and it's why other countries around the world are focused on the moon. So I think it's important for us to know and be the first.
One final question. So the report that NASA submitted to Congress outlines a plan to return to the lunar surface no later than 2029. Now, I would note President Kennedy's speech at Rice that has been referenced multiple times today, was given on September 12, 1962, calling for our country to go to the moon within a decade. And 7 years later, Neil Armstrong would step foot on the lunar surface on July 20th, 1969. So help this committee understand why it took 7 years in the 1960s to get to the moon, and yet today it's going to take till the end of the 2020s.
Wonderful question, and Senator, just so you know, that's the first question I asked when I showed up as the NASA. Why is it taking so long? There's a couple of things that are colluding here. Number one, back then, if you look at real dollars, the budget of NASA was about $50 billion annually. Right now we're talking about a $21 billion annual budget, so it's a lot less of a budget. The other thing that's important to note is what we're doing now is entirely different than what we did back then. Back then, it was a space race. We were trying to defeat the Soviet Union by getting there first, proving our technological superiority, proving our economic and political superiority in conjunction with that, in essence, space race victory. What we're doing today is entirely different, and we're the only country on the face of the planet that can lead this effort, and that is this. 1969 to 1972, we had 6 missions land on the surface of the moon with 12 people. And then we came home, and we haven't been back since. What Space Policy Directive 1 says is we're going to go to the moon, and we're going to go sustainably. In other words, we're going to build an architecture where we can go back and forth. And we're going to have landers and rovers and robots and humans with access to the moon, more access to more parts of the moon than ever before, utilizing, because of the budget constraints, utilizing international partners and utilizing commercial partners with an open architecture where the United States of America is in the lead. And then others can build parts or pieces and ultimately advance our agenda, which is to lead in space. So what we're doing is different, a sustainable architecture where we can get to more parts of the moon, going to the poles, and learning more than we've ever been able to learn before, and at the same time doing it at a budget that's much less. So when you do the analysis, and we've just went through a process at NASA where we did the analysis, the question is, how is it that given the advances in technology, the miniaturization of electronics, how is it that we're not able to do more than we did in the 1960s? The answer is we're doing a lot more than we ever did in the 1960s, and we're doing it with a budget that's just a lot smaller.
Thank you. Senator Markey. Thank you, Senator Markey. Administrator Bridenstine, China has announced their intention to have an operational space station in low Earth orbit by 2022. Do you have concerns that if the administration were to deorbit the ISS in 2024, that China could have the only operational platform in low Earth orbit?
It's a big concern, but to be perfectly clear, there is no plan to deorbit the International Space Station. So if that was the case, the answer would be very concerned. What we want to do is transition to commercialization of low Earth orbit. Again, if NASA can be one customer of many customers, it drives down our costs. And if we have multiple providers that are competing on both cost and innovation, we see what happens. When we had launch providers competing on cost and innovation, for the first time we're seeing these rockets launch and then come back and land, and then we use them again. And because they're proven, insurance rates are actually lower than they would have been for a new rocket, which is an amazing kind of, I didn't predict, a lot of people didn't predict that we're building certainty and at the same time saving money. Imagine, Senator, when you flew to Washington, D.C. from Houston, Texas. When you got here, you had to throw the 737 in the trash. That would be a very expensive plane ticket. But because we can reuse airplanes over and over again, it drives down the cost, it increases access, now the whole world can fly. We're trying to do the same thing in space. And we're doing it right now with launch, and we're seeing a lot of success. But it's because, quite frankly, we heard Senator Nelson talk about how the United States of America is now the largest exporter of commercial launch. And in fact, we're not just the largest, we're larger than the rest of the world combined at 57% predicted. This year it would be 65%. So that's a wonderful thing. The question is, why did that happen? It's because NASA said, we want to buy launch as a service, and we want you providers to compete on how you're going to sell us your service. We're going to, instead of purchasing, owning, and operating our rockets, we want you to, in essence, we're going to pay you for the service, and we're going to be one customer of many, and we want you guys to compete on price. All of a sudden, we're seeing reusable rockets. And that's now, launch is an export for the United States of America at a time when we have, right now in this country, a massive trade deficit. So that's a positive thing, and NASA is a big piece of why that is. Question is, can we replicate that in low Earth orbit? And there are companies that are interested internationally building consortia that could maybe operate the International Space Station, commercially. Is that possible? I don't know, but what we have done, and I think this is an important point, we have forced the conversation to take it very seriously. There was a time at the end of the Apollo program and before the Space Shuttle program where we had 8 years where we weren't launching into space. And of course, now that the retirement of the shuttle is complete and we don't have commercial crew yet, we've got another 8-year gap. What we want to do is avoid any gap in low Earth orbit. We know that there's a definitive life for the International Space Station. We don't know specifically when that is, but what we want to do is make sure that we are prepared to avoid any gap in low Earth orbit. So, sir, your point is very well made, and we're thinking about it all of the time at NASA and within the administration.
I want to clarify 2 points on your answer. Number one, you agree that it would be completely unacceptable for the only operational platform in low Earth orbit to be China's?
Yes, 100%.
At any point in time, we cannot cede low Earth orbit to China?
Yes.
We've also heard testimony from multiple witnesses before this subcommittee that as a matter of the science, as a matter of the structural integrity, that the ISS is usable at least until 2030. Do you agree with that assessment from a scientific and technical perspective?
It is probably possible, yes. The question is, how much risk are we assuming, and what is the cost of making that happen? And so it is technically feasible to keep it alive to 2030, and maybe even beyond that. Technically, it can be done, yes.
Okay. We talked earlier about the impact, about the objective is going to the moon, and a lot of exciting things about there. But as I said in my opening statement, I want to make sure the moon does not distract from the ultimate objective of Mars. Can you describe how going to the moon is useful for the mission of going to Mars, and how we will keep the focus on Mars and not get distracted by the intermediate step?
Yes, sir. That's a wonderful question. The intent is to get to Mars. And how do you get to Mars? Well, we have this proving ground. And I think probably the best way to characterize it, we're all familiar with Apollo 13. It was a NASA failure, but also at the same time an amazing NASA success. Why was Apollo 13 a success, even though it was a failure? It was because there was a technical problem that would have been catastrophic on the way to Mars, but because they were on their way to the moon, they were able to get home. The glory of the moon is that it's only a 3-day journey home. So we can prove all of the technologies, we can reduce all of the risk, we can try all of the different maturations that are necessary to live and work on another world, and we can do it all at the moon, where if there is a problem, if there is an emergency, we know that we can get people home. The challenge with Mars is that if we go there for the first time, and there's the other challenge, not just the technology and the retirement of risk technologically, the other challenge is human physiology. We know, based on what we've learned on the International Space Station, that our astronauts, they lose 1% to 3% of their bone mass every month on the International Space Station. Their cardiovascular system becomes deconditioned. Their neurovestibular system, of course, gets thrown out of whack to the point where sometimes it takes weeks, if not months, when they get back before they can even drive a car again in some cases. Not in all cases, in some cases. We know that the immune system is very challenged and stressed in a microgravity environment, to the point where it's very easy to get sick in a microgravity environment. And we know, of course, when you go beyond low Earth orbit, there's this radiation environment that can have effects on the human body that we are still learning about. Of course, we don't want to use humans as the test case for that. So all of these physiological changes and understandings we've learned from the International Space Station while we have humans there for a period of 6 months, in many cases, in at least one case, up to a year in low Earth orbit. Now imagine, a 7 to 9 month journey to Mars with all of those physiological challenges happening, and then when you get to Mars, you have to live and work. You have to be perfect. You cannot make a mistake, because if you do, you will not live. And all of those physiological changes and challenges, and then when you get there, you can't come home for at least 2.5 years, because Mars has to be in line with the Earth before you can make that journey home. So it's about a 2-year, 26-month evolution before you can come home, and of course then you've got a 6-month journey home. So this presents a challenge where, do you really want to test all of this out for the first time at Mars? Or can we prove it and test it out on the moon, and that in fact would accelerate our path to get to Mars? So it's technology, it's physiology. The moon is the proving ground, Mars is the goal. So I think that's the reason we go to the moon.
So, and my advice is please don't leave Matt Damon behind when you get to Mars. All right, 3 more questions. One, can you just confirm, as Senator Nelson made reference to in his opening remarks, that the objective is not simply to orbit Mars, but it is to land and have an American boot on Mars and plant an American flag on Mars and begin exploring Mars?
Yes, sir. That's why we go to the surface of the moon. The moon is very different than Mars in the sense that Mars has an atmosphere. So landing on Mars is far more difficult than on the moon. I know that sounds weird. They have an atmosphere. Why would that be harder? Well, when you have to re-enter into an atmosphere and the velocities at which you're traveling, it becomes a very complicated scenario. Now, here's the good thing. The United States of America is the only country that has successfully landed on Mars. We've done it 7 times, and we're doing it again November 26th, the Monday after Thanksgiving at 11 a.m. So that's going to be another big day for the United States of America. So all of that being said, there are differences between the moon and Mars, but we do want to get to the surface of Mars, and so we want to replicate as much as we can from the moon. We want to prove and test as much as we can at the moon. And then where we need to make changes, while we're doing that at the moon, we're going to be developing the technologies and capabilities for Mars. We talked about the gateway, which would be in orbit around the moon. Think of a reusable command module that our landers can go back and forth from to the surface of the moon. We think about the tugs from Earth orbit to lunar orbit. That gateway, the first one is a technology demonstrator. It's about proving capability. It's about NASA learning how to do this again. The second one, and there's no decision that's been made on this. I'm just thinking visually, like, what is the second one? Well, the second one could very well be a deep space transport. That's our path to get to Mars. So what we do at the moon is critically important for going to Mars. And a lot of the experts that you talk to at NASA would say we can't get to Mars without going to the moon.
Okay. Last month, I was joined by Senator Cornyn and Representatives Babin, Culberson, and Smith in sending you a letter requesting that NASA's Johnson Space Center serve as the lead center for NASA's Lunar Lander program. In my opinion, JSC is a natural fit for the program, given that JSC has historically served as the lead center for human spaceflight for more than half a century. Has NASA made any decisions pertaining to how it intends to set up the Lunar Lander program?
You're really trying to make me make news, aren't you, Senator?
Doing my best.
Okay. First of all, Johnson Space Center, critical part of all of our lunar activities. It will be part of, the gateway, part of landers as well. As far as what centers are going to have specific what responsibilities, we're going through a process right now to evaluate all of that. Just know that Johnson Space Center is going to be a critical piece of that, but I'm not ready to announce what their particular position will be.
Final question. Last month, I introduced legislation, was joined by Senator Markey, Senator Nelson, Senator Thune, legislation was called the Hidden Figures Way Designation Act. And it was legislation to rename the street in front of NASA's headquarters here in Washington, Hidden Figures Way, after the incredible pioneers, the African-American mathematicians who blazed the way for our going to the moon. The D.C. City Council Chairman, Mendelson, introduced a companion bill last week that was joined by all 12 other council members, so unanimous companion bill, to rename the street, in a strong show of support for every woman who has worked for NASA as a human computer. It's likely that the street in front of NASA headquarters will be designated as Hidden Figures Way before the end of the year. In your judgment, what will the new street name mean for the culture and for the employees at NASA?
It's a wonderful question, and it's an important part of who we are as an agency. As you're aware, NASA is probably the single most inspirational federal agency that we have, and if you walk around the headquarters building and you ask people that are old enough, where were you when Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin walked on the moon, they'll tell you right where they were, and they'll tell you how it changed their lives, the education that they got because of it, and ultimately how they ended up at NASA. It was transformative. And yet, we know the names Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin. Of course, Katherine Johnson was responsible for calculating the orbital trajectory for John Glenn, which, of course, another critically important mission. But there are so many, I think when we landed on the moon, the number of people that were involved in that project at the time was around 400,000. I mean, that's a lot of people. And they're all critically important to what NASA is and what NASA does and the accomplishments of our country. And as you have rightly said, so many of them were hidden. And the more we can give them credit and show them how they contributed, show the next generation how they contributed, that's what it's all about. We want to inspire that next generation. We want NASA, we want to attract the absolute best and the brightest that America has to offer. And so many of those people that were at that time hidden are now going to be those moments of inspiration for the next generation. When I was the summer between my 5th grade and 6th grade year, for the first time, my mom put me in a summer camp where we got to play with a wind tunnel. And I got to play with the camber of a wing. I learned about Bernoulli's theory, and it changed the direction of my life. I knew on that, from that week forward, I was going to be a pilot. Didn't matter what I did for the rest of my life. I knew I was going to be a pilot. And so that had a transformational kind of impact on me. And then, as I eventually ran a Tulsa Air and Space Museum, I saw children have their lives transformed because of experiences they had with the volunteers and others at the Tulsa Air and Space Museum. So those kind of impactful things, I think, are important for developing the next generation of STEM in this country. And the reason that's so important, the country that controls the technology controls the balance of power on Earth. And that's true going back to the beginning of time. Whoever controls technology controls the balance of power. That means our people here in the United States, we have to be preeminent in technology. So the more we can inspire that next generation into STEM, we need to do. So I think it's a great idea.
You sound like you were a precocious 5th grader.
Yeah, right.
You and that Bernoulli fellow. Senator Gardner. Administrator Bridenstine, a couple of questions. We've spent a lot of time in this hearing talking about the objectives for NASA and the need for expenditures. I want to talk a little bit about the revenue side and increasing the resources NASA has available to do this. The Washington Post has reported that requests from individuals and companies to use NASA's logo on T-shirts and other commercial items is getting a lot of interest. For example, there is NASA-themed apparel made for Target, Old Navy, Land's End, Coach, and H&M. The designer, Heron Preston, even sells a NASA T-shirt for $270. Despite this commercial interest, NASA right now doesn't make anything on the sales of products using its logo. Do you agree with this policy, and has NASA taken any steps to receive compensation off the sale of the agency's logo?
That is an important question, and so the answer is we have a logo. We have a right to that logo, and because we have the rights to that logo and somebody else finds value in it, they should pay for the rights to use that logo. I get that. And I'll be honest, I don't know if anybody's bought the rights to use that logo or not. I don't know. I haven't looked into this issue. I have noticed, as you have, I'm seeing a lot of NASA T-shirts on the streets. I will tell you, I have found that personally as a source of pride, that people are so interested in it. And I haven't made any effort to try to quell it or squash it. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't. And I'll be honest, I don't know what the right answer here is. If you have any ideas, I'd be more than thrilled to listen to them. But in my view, I love the fact that I see so many NASA logos on the streets.
Well, for what it's worth, I agree with you that it's a great thing that people are excited about NASA, that they're wanting to wear NASA clothing, but I also think that NASA should be compensated for it. And I'm a believer in commercializing and seeking revenue streams. And look, I can tell you I've never owned any T-shirt that costs $270. And by the way, having seen your wardrobe, I'm pretty confident you haven't either. But if somebody's paying $270 for a T-shirt, a chunk of that ought to go to NASA and actually help fund getting to the moon and getting to Mars. A related point in terms of commercialization. Earlier this year, cases testified before our subcommittee that more than 55% of payloads to the national lab are private sector customers, which includes projects from iconic Fortune 500 companies and innovation startups. Now, I want to be clear that I support having vast amounts of research conducted on ISS, but given that the American taxpayers are subsidizing the transportation costs to and from station, astronaut crew time to conduct the experiments, and the operational and maintenance cost of the national lab, it is worth a close examination of how research is being conducted right now and if there's a need to alter current research agreements. A few specific examples. Goodyear is using microgravity to better understand silica morphology for manufacturing new tires with low rolling resistance that are more fuel efficient and safer. Cases material states that, quote, research could give Goodyear a competitive advantage in the tire industry by developing superior rubber materials. Another example, Merck is using microgravity to grow a crystalline suspension of millions of tiny uniform crystals to improve the formulation of the company's cancer immunotherapy drug, Keytruda. Keytruda is the drug that made former President Jimmy Carter's cancer go into remission, and Forbes has reported that some analysts predict that Keytruda may be Merck's next $10 billion drug. Administrator Bridenstine, do you believe that NASA and Congress should re-examine these agreements to ensure that the American taxpayers are receiving fair compensation for the research that is being conducted by iconic Fortune 500 companies that may result in giving these companies a competitive advantage in their respective industries? Yes,
I do believe those kind of programs and opportunities on the International Space Station, we need to re-examine those, and I intend to do that as a new administrator. In fact, we are. We're looking at it right now. It's also important to note, and I think this is an important point to make. We want those kind of activities happening inside the United States of America, and there is no shortage right now of enthusiasm on the part of our largest peer competitor, China, to have these activities going on their space station that they're building for the future. So the answer is yes, we need to examine it. What we don't want to do is we don't want to damage the commercialization of low Earth orbit because we are charging for something that they can get for free in a different country. And so we have to be really careful about how we balance that. But certainly it's something to take a look at.
And I think that's a fair point and concern you raise, and something that I look forward to continuing to work with you on. It seems to me we have many research universities in the United States that have very successful commercialization programs where there's innovation and research being conducted in the universities, and the universities in turn receive a portion of the profits, and that helps fund even more innovation, even more research, and that's a model it seems to me NASA should look at, given the enormous potential. But you're right, we certainly need to look at it within a framework of a competitive environment in China and other nations potentially as competitors.
I would also add, both of these items that you brought up, whether it's activities happening on the International Space Station that could potentially result in big profits for corporations, terrestrially, I think that's an important thing for the United States to be leading in. And even something as simple as the NASA logo. These are ideas, I think, that we need to be considering. It's also important, and I'd love to work with you on this. As you're aware, appropriators guard very jealously appropriation dollars. And to the extent that we were to receive some kind of proceeds from those activities, and maybe there's an opportunity to do that and we should be doing it. My concern would be NASA would be doing all the work, and then those proceeds could end up going to the general treasury, or they could end, and look, I love the general treasury. I want to retire the deficit as much as anybody else. But what I don't want to, I would love to see us utilize those proceeds for the advancement of human spaceflight, for the advancement of our science, for the advancement of understanding our planet. These are the activities that I would love to see those proceeds going toward, and not necessarily just going into the general coffers.
Well, unsurprisingly, you and I are on the same page on that, and indeed, much of my interest here is to generate a revenue stream that can be dedicated directly to space exploration, to ensure that we have the resources to continue America's leadership going back to the moon and ultimately going back to Mars, and ensuring that we have sufficient investment and that we're also in a position where we're leveraging billions more in private investment as well. And so I look forward to continuing to work with you on that. Yes. Administrator Bridenstine, thank you for your testimony. Thank you for being here. I think this was a productive hearing. The hearing record will remain open for 2 weeks. During that time, senators are asked to submit any questions for the record. Upon receipt, the witness is requested to submit your written answers to the committee as soon as possible. And with that, this hearing is adjourned.
Thank you, sir.